from union activities. So they were nominal members of unions, but they were not very active in union activities. They were indifferent, in fact, to unions. And some of them, when I spoke to them about unions and activities, they said, we see you, this is like an imbizo. What's a woman going to do in an imbizo? We let men do this for us. They go and attend. Like I said, some of them, their husbands are mine workers. So they attended the union meetings and gave them report back of what they thought was relevant to the women. So they distanced themselves from all of these things. Now, I did my research in 2011 and 2012. And in 2012, if you remember, it was a very volatile time around the Rustenburg area. There were lots of strikes, and Marikana also happened around the same time. But women refused to participate in strikes, saying that these are not proper for women. So their refusal was rooted in their ideas of how they saw themselves as proper women, who cannot be seen jumping up and down in a strike. It's for men. So those are some of the things, but interestingly, their refusal to do work, to participate in strikes, it was not seen as disrespectful. It was not seen as women who are lazy, as we often hear. But men interpreted this refusal as respect. So these women, these Mafazi, are respecting us as men, they're respecting our space, they're respecting mine culture, they're respectful women, basically. That's why they're refusing. That's why we want to help them. And I argue in my paper that these women actually, they performed marginality, but it was not just a performance of marginality, it was a performance of a productive marginality that enabled and helped them to avoid and escape mine work. So because they performed this marginal status of a woman or a mother or a wife, they were able to say, I can't do this and get away with it. So there was a lot of agency in the ways in which they performed femininity. They were not just victims of this mind space that's masculine. That's the first one. The second one, they called them, and they saw them, they call them money makers. And money makers, unlike the first group, they were younger. They were often daughters, some of them were daughters of mine workers. But also what's important about money makers is that they were more educated than most of the other workers. So yes, all the women had grade 12, but with money makers, they had a post-metric qualification also. And so these women, because of their post-metric, a lot of times they kept referring to their education to justify why they should not be in mining. But just as a background again on money makers is that they emphasized their sexuality. So it was not about them being women, it was not about them being mothers. In fact, they didn't associate in those ways. They saw themselves as women. They emphasized their sexuality. They also did not want to do mine work. But what's different again about them is, unlike saying that we women, unlike saying that like the first group emphasizing being mothers, for them they emphasize sexuality. But also beyond that, so a lot of them also bribed a lot because they were not willingly assisted. These women were actually seen as rebellious women, as women who don't want to do mine work. They were seen as lazy, even though they were doing the very same things that the first group were doing. But the interpretation was very different. They were seen as lazy, they were seen as loose women, they were seen as opinionated women, because these were young women also, they had this education. But these women also did not identify as mine workers. And they kept insisting to me that, Asanda, I'm not a mine worker, I work in the mines. There's a difference between the two. And because of the way they saw themselves, they did not want to be seen underground. They didn't want to work underground, in the underground occupations especially. They could go underground, take measurements, and leave as soon as possible, because they saw underground as this dirty place, as a low-class status, something that they didn't identify with. And so one other thing that's key about them is that they preferred to work on surface, so they didn't want to be located firmly underground. But also another thing that's important is that they had this transitory status, or rather they saw themselves as just in mining for a temporary period. So we are in mining, but remember, we have education. We can always get other jobs outside mining or on surface if we're still in the mine. So we're not mine workers, but we're working in the mines. Just like the other group that I talked to, the Mafazi, they also refused to speak Fanagalo, but it was a refusal for different reasons. For them, Fanagalo symbolized low status, and so they could not, it was not about being a proper woman, but it was about the status of Fanagalo, that it's a low status. I do not want to be heard speaking Fanagalo. Already in our communities, they are calling us Masari wa Fanagalo, meaning those women who speak Fanagalo, which is seen as a very derogatory label. So they didn't want to be seen as Fanagalo women. But while they refused to speak Fanagalo, what I found interesting about this category, this group, is that they wanted to use some of the vocabulary that's closely associated with Fanagalo. So they would use words like spukupuku or wenashit, and those are very common underground, but these are seen as improper for women. Yet these women wanted to use those words. And they wanted to use these words precisely because they went against men's ideas of what a proper woman should do, or what the language that a proper woman should use. So it was their way of constructing themselves as outsiders, this refusal to speak Fanagalo, but using the language that's not associated with women. So that's how they constructed themselves. But also at the center of it is that to validate this outsider status, or upper, higher, beta, different status that they adopted, was that a lot of the money makers also rejected traditional unions. So they were not indifferent to them, they rejected them instead. So a lot of them were not members of AMCU, they were not members of the NUM, they wanted to be members of UWASA, precisely because UWASA organizes mainly middle management and white workers. And for them, because they were so attached to a different class, for them, UWASA represented superiority, UWASA represented power. But also UWASA had benefits that they felt like spoke to their aspirations for a different status, their aspirations to distinguish themselves also from other mine workers. UWASA, for instance, had benefits. You could go and buy stuff at Pick n Pay at a discount, not at Boxer. And that was very important for them. The fact that you're buying at Pick n Pay and you're buying at a discount, not at ShopRite and not at Boxer. But also you could have access to things like AVBOB, which is an insurance, a lot of things that other mine workers could not lay claim to through their unions. They had to pay for them separately. These women felt like UWASA represents them, how they see themselves. But also equally important for joining UWASA, they felt like, well, UWASA does not, the other unions are very political and they've forgotten about us as women. Remember, these are sexualized women. They're the ones who, in order to get work done, they have to let people touch them. So they felt like other unions also do not take sexual harassment seriously, especially when it comes from them, since they are already seen in sexualized ways. But they felt like UWASA, to some degree, is responsive to this. But another thing that appealed to them about UWASA is that UWASA didn't expect them to participate in strikes. The morning before a strike, if UWASA members know in advance, they send text messages to everyone who's an UWASA member and say, don't come to work tomorrow. There's possibilities that there's going to be a strike and it's going to be violent. Don't come to work, but we'll check it, we'll sign you in, you will still be paid. So again, for these women, UWASA appealed a lot more than all other unions. So I argue that these women, again, they performed femininity that went against a lot of these prescribed feminine behaviors. I mean, these women rejected men as the authorities underground. If they didn't want to work and their sexualizing themselves didn't work to their advantage, they just refused to work and did their own thing. So in a way, they refused to abide by the rules of the men in relation to them. And the third group were real Mafazi. Okay, pretty fast. Real Mafazi. Now, real Mafazi were different from the two other groups that I've talked about. Instead of talking about emphasizing sexuality or gender roles, they did mind work, and they did mind work very well. For instance, this one woman said to me, because she changed, she wanted to stop being a Mafazi and be a real Mafazi now. So she said, I had to stop being a water girl. I said, no more being a water girl. They came and they wanted me to go and get water for them, and I completely refused because I wanted to be seen as a real worker. But not just as a real worker, but a real worker who is still a woman. So not a real worker who adopts the ways of working that men enact. So also, these women, while they were real workers and they saw themselves as real workers, they did not planisa like men. They did not use their bodies to accomplish tasks the same way that men use their bodies. For instance, when we were cleaning the face, cleaning the ore, lashing, a lot of the women that I worked with who were real Mafazi, they would kneel next to the face and try and scrape ore sideways. But men would sit with their bums, legs wide apart and drag the ore towards themselves. And women These real Mafazi, because they wanted to continue being seen as respectful women, but hard-working women, they said we can't do like that. We can't sit with our legs wide open and drag all towards ourselves. We have to sit like proper women, but we'll still do the work. So they did work. They were seen as strong women, just not good women like the first category. And even then, there's things that we can talk about when we go into question time about how they understood union or their relationship with unions. So these women, I think one thing I want to take away from that, is that these are women who resisted adopting these masculine ways of working underground. So they did mine work, but they resisted doing mine work like men. They resisted seeing the mines the same way that men saw them. And they saw them in a way that they made sure that their femininity intersects with productivity. It's not something that's disengaged from each other. So they brought the two, femininity and productivity, together. The last group, in the last 2 minutes, right? Okay. The last group, we call them Madoda Straight. Now the name says it all. They worked like men, they blanised like men, they were able. So one woman said to me, who's a Madoda Straight? She said, I'm a man at work and I'm a woman at home. Like, don't make any mistake of trying to treat me like a woman at work or expecting things that you would expect from women from me. I'm not like that. They were very productive, but part of this productivity meant also taking risks like men who are seen as Madoda Straight men. And for some of these women that I worked with, one, for instance, was a miner. She was the most productive, not amongst women, but throughout the shaft, between different levels. She was the most productive. But part of her being productive meant that she had to blast by hand every day to make sure that her stove blasts. So it's taking these risks. And when you question her about them, it's the Madoda Straight risk. It's not the Spukupuku risk that you should not do. But women, Madoda Straight, it was not just about working, but it was about how they worked, the way they used their bodies. A lot of times when I worked with them, kept emphasizing that it's not about the physical strength, Asanda, but it's how you manage to summon your whole body and make it do work, and make it do work in ways that are convincing to your team members also, but that are consistent with mind worker logics at the same time. So it was about how they brought their bodies together and used them to achieve productivity. And this was done systematically and rhythmically and very consistently. And so it was not just about how you winch, for instance, about operating the winch, but it was about how you twist your wrists, things like that. These small things, how you twist your wrist, how your shoulders are in relation to your feet. So it could not just be about you doing the work and completing it, but also how you control your breathing as you're doing these things, and how your legs move, how your body moves, how you're able to summon and control your body in a very conscious but unreflexive way at the same time. So it was not just about doing work for this category, it was about doing work in a very specific way. It was about doing work and doing masculinity at the same time, and that's how they managed to do the work. They distance themselves obviously from everything and anything feminine, and that's why I've got over there. So I asked them what, because a lot of times when I worked with women who identified as Madoda Straight, they did not want us to attend any of the meetings that are organized by women. And so every time when I ask, but you don't know what they're going to talk about, they're going to talk about something different maybe, let's give it a try. They'll be like, no, they're probably going to talk about toilet sprays and mirrors. I'm not interested in that. So again, this distancing and ridiculing femininity and what it stands for. And I argue that these women actually, they destabilize a lot of things about how we understand mine workers or mine workers in female bodies. They destabilize things, but at the same time, they seem to be reinforcing certain things, and we can go into that during question time. But I think all these femininities for me, what it's about, it's again, I mean, women were brought into the minds for this transformation project, changing, incorporating women. And I think one of the questions, and I'm still trying to answer that, and we can go into more detail during the question and answer session, but it's about their capacity, their transformative capacity in these different types. Are these women changing things underground or not changing things? Is it a matter of reproducing things or reinforcing masculine hegemony underground? Or is there really transformative capacity in the ways that they enact femininity underground? Thanks, Jacob.
I've tried to be strict with those speakers because these are such rich papers, and I think we will benefit from very robust conversation. So, without wasting too much time, I'm going to start with Ulwazi, Malusi, Zwake, and the sister at the back there. Adriana, is your hand up? No. Okay, fine. Yeah. So, Ulwazi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the two presenters, especially the leader of our people. If yesterday I left with an impression that SWAP uses black people as objects to study how they work, without studying how white people work, today I'm given an impression that black people can think. But I want to push Mwisebi's talk first, in a direction that probably you had no intention or had not intended it to go. Now, the preface Bantu to education suggests to me that the school was actually not just the zone for the reproduction of junior black subjects, but it looks to me like Bantu, because of the lack of humanity amongst black people, was also the zone of nullity, was the zone of ontological nullity for black people. Now, if it was intended as that zone of alterity, zone of ontological nullity for black people, it would seem that there is somewhere where the logic of that modern rational thought fails, because emerges in that very zone of ontological nullity a collective subject of emancipation. Now, what I want to try and ask you do is to think of the school as that zone of ontological nullity, but that produces a collective subject of emancipation. How is it able, how does this collective subject, as you call it, the critical student, the critical collective student mass, how is it able to defy the logic of the school as that space of ontological nullity? The second point is the point about what I call political love. Now, if the activists that you speak of, that will go onto the streets to become gangs, but retain a certain political ethic that would refuse, them leaping or edging over into being mere criminals, I would suspect that they were sustained by something I want to call, and I know we've had discussions with you about this, what we call political love. Now, if there was this possibility of people who were engaged in criminal activities as gangs refusing the appellation of criminality, what role did political love play in sustaining most of the youth activists that you spoke of? And lastly, Asanda's interesting talk. I want to go back to this concept of Planisa because it emerged yesterday also. In a larger ethnographic study of the usage of this term, I suspect that we may gain something far larger. I'm not Xhosa, but I do know that amongst the Xhosas, the concept of Planisa is it governs everyday life, where people would say, now, it's not a workplace thing. It's a part of a larger black life on how we survive everyday life as black people. So it doesn't emerge in the workplace. It has a larger genealogy that if you start from the modernist space of work, you lose its larger significance and how it governs general black life, especially, as I've said, if you do a larger ethnographic history of the term. This is linked to the singing for the machine. Again, if you probe further this activity of singing for the machine, it's not only amongst the workers who work in the mines. Virtually every black person, maybe not virtually every black person, but most black people, would engage in some sort of, divination before they begin their work. Whether they pray the machine or the ancestors, in order that the ancestors be with them in the process of work so that they achieve their goals. It seems to me that it would call us to extend again the parameters from which we start to study these things. Thanks.
Make it act like a Bantu teacher from now on. Let's blame Malwazi for that. Malwazi, please be quick, no preface. No, just your question. Yeah, so Malwazi, Umzwati, and Sis, let him move on.
Okay, I'll be quite quick. My question is for Asanda.